The brisk February air carried an eerie stillness as Detective Nora Langley parked her unmarked car at the edge of Cedar Ridge's woodland. Around her, officers moved methodically, marking evidence with fluorescent tape. The morning light struggled to pierce through the dense canopy above, creating an interplay of shadows that seemed to dance with the wind. Nora tightened her scarf and stepped onto the frozen ground. The call had come early. Another body found, this time a high school cheerleader. A grimace tugged at the corners of her mouth. Cedar Ridge wasn't the kind of town where murders happened, yet here she was. Detective Langley, a young officer, called, gesturing toward a taped-off section. "The scene's ready for you." The victim lay in the clearing, her blonde hair sprawled like a halo against the dark earth. Emily Harper, just 17, was still wearing her cheerleading uniform. Her once vivid green eyes stared unseeing at the sky, a contrast to the vibrant, confident girl she had been described as. Emily's hands were curled tightly around a crumpled piece of paper. "She fought," Nora murmured, crouching down. Emily's neck bore the telltale marks of strangulation. A silk scarf, pale and delicate, was tangled in her fingers, a cruel juxtaposition of beauty and violence. The medical examiner, Dr. Alan Becker, approached with his usual solemn demeanor. "Time of death was likely late last night," he stated. "Signs of struggle, as you can see. Cause of death, strangulation. But it gets interesting." Nora raised an eyebrow. "Found this crumpled in her hand," Becker said, holding up the note sealed in a plastic bag. Nora scanned the words. Written in hurried scrawl, it read, "We need to talk. Meet me tonight. Don't tell anyone." The detective's eyes narrowed. This wasn't random. This was personal. Back at the station, Nora leaned against her desk, staring at Emily's photo. Cheerleader, honor student, popular. She had everything going for her. And yet, here she was, another victim in a world too cruel to care about youth and promise. Emily's parents sat across from her, their faces pale and strained. Mrs. Harper clutched a tissue, while Mr. Harper gripped the arm of his chair as though letting go would make his grief consume him. Emily was. "She was everything to us," Mrs. Harper choked out. "How could this happen? Did she seem worried or distracted recently?" Nora asked gently. "Maybe she mentioned someone she was meeting or any trouble she was having." The Harpers exchanged a glance. "She was different," Mr. Harper admitted. "Since the divorce, she was distant, moody. I thought it was just teenage stuff." Nora nodded, her pen moving across her notepad. Divorce often left scars deeper than anyone cared to admit. "Did she have a boyfriend?" "Anyone who might have had issues with her. She wasn't seeing anyone," Mrs. Harper said quickly. Too quickly. But when Nora spoke to Emily's best friend, Taylor Reed, later that day, a different story emerged. "She wasn't exactly single," Taylor said, twisting a strand of her auburn hair nervously. "But you can't tell anyone, okay? Emily would kill me if she knew I told. She's gone," Taylor, Nora said gently. "The only way to help her now is to tell me the truth." Taylor hesitated, then took a deep breath. She was seeing someone older, a lot older. "How much older?" "Like 30s. He's married, too," Taylor whispered. "Daniel Mercer." The baseball coach. Nora felt her breath catch. Daniel Mercer, respected coach, family man, father of 2. The revelation was like a gut punch, but it also explained the secrecy in Emily's note. A married coach and a cheerleader? The implications were damning. Daniel Mercer's life, at least outwardly, appeared picture perfect. A former minor league player turned coach, he was a man of discipline and charm. His wife, Rachel, stayed home to care for their infant daughter and toddler son. But appearances, as Nora knew too well, often lied. It didn't take long for her to connect the dots. Emily, a teenager dealing with her parents' divorce, had turned to someone who could provide guidance or what she thought was love. Daniel, for his part, likely saw an escape from the pressures of his crumbling marriage. Nora made her way to Cedar Ridge High School the next morning, the halls buzzing with the kind of restless energy only teenagers could muster. She found Daniel Mercer in the gym, running drills with his team. The moment their eyes met, his smile faltered. "Detective Langley," he said, approaching her. "What can I do for you? We need to talk," Nora said, her tone leaving no room for argument. In his office, Daniel sat across from her, his hands fidgeting. "This is about Emily Harper, isn't it?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Nora nodded. "When was the last time you saw her?"
She came to practice last week." "Like always," he said, avoiding her gaze. "Coach Mercer, I know about the relationship," Nora said firmly. "You were involved with her." His face drained of color. "That's not true." "Then why would Emily's best friend tell me otherwise? Why would she have your burner phone number?" Daniel's silence spoke louder than any denial could. By the end of the week, Nora had gathered more than enough circumstantial evidence to connect Daniel to Emily. CCTV footage showed Emily getting into his car the night she disappeared. Fibers from her cheerleading uniform were found in his SUV. And yet, something didn't sit right with Nora. If Daniel had killed her, why leave the note? Why not cover his tracks better? Rachel Mercer, Daniel's wife, provided a stark contrast to his defensive demeanor. She was pale and exhausted when Nora interviewed her, the weight of postpartum depression clear in her posture. "I don't know anything about Emily Harper," Rachel said flatly. "But I know my husband. He wouldn't do something like this. Even if he felt cornered?" Nora pressed. "Even if she was pregnant?" Rachel's eyes widened, her hands shaking as she reached for the glass of water in front of her. "Pregnant?" she whispered. Nora froze. The look of shock seemed genuine. But then again, grief and anger could twist people into liars. The revelation of Emily's pregnancy cracked open a Pandora's box of possibilities. For Detective Nora Langley, the case was no longer just about the forbidden relationship between a coach and his student. It was about desperation, secrets, and the lengths people would go to protect their lives from imploding. Sitting in her car outside the Mercer residence, Nora reviewed her notes. Rachel Mercer had been visibly shaken at the mention of Emily's pregnancy. Either she was genuinely unaware, or she was hiding something much darker. Both scenarios painted Rachel as a person teetering on the edge of a breakdown. Inside, the Mercer home told a different story. The living room was pristine, adorned with family photos that suggested a life of suburban bliss. Nora sat across from Rachel, whose demeanor had shifted since their last conversation. Today, she appeared calmer, her hands steady as they gripped a mug of tea. "I've thought a lot about what you said, Detective," Rachel began, her voice even. "About Emily, and about the pregnancy. I don't know if my husband did this, but I know he's been keeping secrets from me." "Secrets like what?" Nora prompted, her pen poised. Rachel hesitated. "I found a phone. A burner phone. It was in his gym bag. At first, I thought it was for something harmless, but then I started seeing the messages." "What kind of messages?" Nora asked, leaning forward. "From her." "From Emily," Rachel admitted, her voice trembling. "She called him Danny. She told him she loved him, that she needed him to leave me. When I confronted him, he swore it was over. He said it was a mistake." The room fell silent except for the faint sound of Rachel's tea being set down on the table. Nora studied her, noting the hollow look in her eyes. Postpartum depression was a storm that Rachel seemed barely able to weather, and now this? It was a dangerous cocktail. "Where is the phone now?" Nora asked. "I destroyed it," Rachel said bluntly. "I couldn't bear to look at it." Nora fought the urge to sigh. Destroyed evidence was the last thing she needed, but Rachel's admission opened a new avenue. If Rachel had known about the affair, could she have acted on it? Jealousy was a powerful motive. Meanwhile, forensic evidence continued to pile up against Daniel. Fibers from Emily's cheerleading uniform matched the ones found in his SUV. Soil from the wooded area where her body was discovered was embedded in the carpet beneath the passenger seat. Yet Daniel maintained his innocence. "I didn't kill her," he said during an interrogation. His voice cracked with emotion. "I admit I was involved with her. It was stupid, wrong, but I didn't kill her." "Then explain how her uniform fibers ended up in your car," Nora said, her tone sharp. "Explain why the last known footage of her alive shows her getting into your vehicle." Daniel ran his hands through his hair, the weight of his choices crushing him. "She called me that night. She said we needed to talk. I told her to meet me near the school, where no one would see us." "What did she want to talk about?" Nora pressed. "She told me she was pregnant," he confessed, tears streaming down his face. "She begged me to leave Rachel, to be with her. I told her I couldn't do that. I have a family." "And then what?" Nora's voice was icy, unyielding. "She got angry. She started yelling, crying. I told her I couldn't help her. She got out of the car, slammed the door, and walked off. That was the last time I saw her." "Do you expect me to believe that you just let her go?" Nora snapped. "That you left a pregnant, emotional teenager in the middle of the night and nothing happened?" "Yes," Daniel shouted. "I didn't hurt her." Nora left the interrogation room, frustration bubbling beneath her calm exterior. His story was weak, but it wasn't entirely implausible. If Daniel didn't kill Emily, someone else had, and that someone had to be close enough to know about the affair and the pregnancy. The breakthrough came 3 days later, when forensic analysts identified fingerprints on the silk scarf used to strangle Emily. The prints didn't belong to Daniel. They belonged to Rachel Mercer. Nora stared at the report, her pulse quickening. Rachel's confession about the burner phone suddenly took on a sinister edge. Could she have followed Daniel that night? Confronted Emily in a fit of rage? The pieces were falling into place, but there were still gaps in the story. Rachel was brought in for questioning again. This time, her composure cracked almost immediately. "I was angry," Rachel admitted, tears streaming down her face. "When I found the phone, I thought my world was ending. I followed him that night. I wanted to see if he was meeting her again." "What happened when you saw her?" Nora asked, her tone neutral but firm. "I waited in the shadows," Rachel whispered. "I watched her get into his car. I thought he'd tell her it was over, that he'd come back to me. But when she got out and started walking away, I lost it." "What did you do?" Nora pressed. "I confronted her," Rachel sobbed. "I told her she was destroying my family. She laughed at me, called me pathetic. I didn't mean to hurt her. But she grabbed me, and I snapped." "Did Daniel know what you had done?" Nora asked. "No," Rachel said firmly. "I left him out of it. I thought I could make it go away." Rachel's confession sent shockwaves through Cedar Ridge. The community had rallied around her as the wronged wife, the victim of her husband's betrayal. Now, she was the one standing accused of murder. During the trial, the prosecution painted Rachel as a jealous, unstable woman who had carefully planned her confrontation with Emily. The defense argued that Rachel's actions were the result of postpartum depression and emotional manipulation by Daniel, who had created the toxic situation in the first place. Daniel testified, his guilt and shame evident. "I never wanted any of this to happen," he said. "I take responsibility for my mistakes, but I didn't kill Emily. I loved her." Rachel's pale face remained stoic throughout the trial, her eyes distant as though she were already serving her sentence in her mind. She didn't deny her actions but insisted that she had never intended to kill Emily. The courtroom was packed, buzzing with the whispers of Cedar Ridge residents eager to witness the unfolding drama. Rachel Mercer sat stoically at the defense table, her face pale, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Across from her, Emily Harper's parents sat with their grief laid bare, their eyes fixed on the woman accused of killing their daughter. Detective Nora Langley observed the scene from the gallery, her mind heavy with the weight of the case. She had pieced together the events leading to Emily's death, but even now, she couldn't shake the sense that not everything had been laid bare. The prosecution began its case with unrelenting fervor. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," the lead prosecutor began, pacing in front of the panel. Rachel Mercer knew about her husband's affair. She knew about Emily Harper's pregnancy. She didn't confront her husband or seek help. No. She followed Emily that night, cornered her, and strangled her in a jealous rage. This was not an accident. This was premeditated. He presented the evidence meticulously, the fingerprints on the silk scarf, the text messages Rachel had seen, and her own confession. It painted a picture of a woman driven to the brink, consumed by anger and betrayal. The jury listened intently, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and discomfort. Rachel's defense attorney, however, countered with a different story. "Yes, Rachel Mercer killed Emily Harper," the lawyer admitted, his voice steady. "But it wasn't planned. Rachel was a victim of postpartum depression, of betrayal, of emotional manipulation. That night, she wasn't thinking clearly. She acted out of pain and confusion, not malice." He detailed Rachel's struggles, her descent into postpartum depression after the birth of her second child, and the toll Daniel's affair had taken on her mental health. He argued that Rachel's confrontation with Emily had escalated unexpectedly and that the resulting tragedy was a terrible accident, not murder. The prosecution called its first witness, Taylor Reed, Emily's best friend. Taylor approached the stand with trembling hands, her gaze darting around the courtroom. After being sworn in, she recounted Emily's relationship with Daniel Mercer. She was going through a lot," Taylor said, her voice breaking. "Her parents were divorcing, and she felt like she didn't have anyone. He made her feel special." "What did Emily say about Rachel Mercer?" the prosecutor asked. "She said Rachel was unstable," Taylor replied, her words laced with hesitation. "Emily thought Rachel suspected something. She was scared of her." The defense objected, citing hearsay, but the damage was done. The jury's eyes flicked toward Rachel, their expressions unreadable. Next, Daniel Mercer took the stand. His appearance was a study in contrasts, well-dressed but visibly exhausted, his once confident demeanor shattered. "I never wanted this to happen," Daniel said, his voice hoarse. "I made a mistake. I was selfish, and I hurt people. But I didn't kill Emily." "Did you know Rachel was following you that night?" the prosecutor asked. "No," Daniel replied firmly. "She didn't tell me anything. I didn't know what she had done until the police told me." Under cross-examination, the defense attorney honed in on Daniel's role in the tragedy. "You knew Emily was vulnerable, didn't you?" the lawyer asked. "Yes," Daniel admitted. "She trusted me, and I took advantage of that trust." "You created the situation that led to her death," the lawyer pressed. "Do you feel responsible?" Daniel's eyes welled with tears. "Every day." The moment Rachel Mercer took the stand, the courtroom fell silent. Her defense attorney had advised against it, but Rachel insisted. She wanted the jury to hear her story from her own lips. "I didn't plan to hurt Emily," Rachel began, her voice trembling. "I just wanted to talk to her. To make her understand what she was doing to my family." "What happened when you confronted her?" the defense attorney asked. Rachel took a deep breath. "She laughed at me. She said Daniel loved her, not me. I lost control. I don't even remember grabbing the scarf. It was like something inside me snapped." The prosecutor's cross-examination was brutal. "Mrs. Mercer, you expect us to believe that you lost control?" he sneered. "You followed her, waited for her, and confronted her in a secluded area. That doesn't sound like someone acting on impulse." Rachel's composure wavered. "I didn't mean to kill her," she said quietly. "But you did," the prosecutor shot back. "And then you left her there, alone in the woods, like garbage." The harsh words hung in the air, leaving the jury visibly uncomfortable. Outside the courtroom, Cedar Ridge was a town torn in two. Some sympathized with Rachel, seeing her as a woman pushed to the brink by her husband's betrayal and mental health struggles. Others viewed her as a cold-blooded murderer who had taken the life of an innocent teenager. Emily's parents, meanwhile, struggled with their grief. They avoided the media, their pain too raw for public consumption. In private, they grappled with the question of forgiveness. "How do you forgive someone who took your child?" Mrs. Harper whispered to her husband one night. "How do you move on?" "I don't know," he admitted, his voice choked with emotion. "But we have to try. For Emily." The trial's final days were marked by impassioned closing arguments. The prosecution reminded the jury of Rachel's deliberate actions, the stalking, the confrontation, the murder. "This wasn't a heat-of-the-moment act," the prosecutor declared. "This was a calculated decision fueled by jealousy and rage." The defense countered by emphasizing Rachel's mental state. She was a woman unraveling, abandoned by her husband and overwhelmed by postpartum depression. This was not premeditated. It was a tragic mistake. The jury deliberated for hours, their decision weighing heavily on their shoulders. When they finally returned, the courtroom held its collective breath. Rachel Mercer stood as the verdict was read, her face a mask of stoic resignation. On the charge of first-degree murder, we find the defendant guilty of manslaughter. The decision was a compromise, reflecting the jury's belief that Rachel had acted recklessly but without clear intent to kill. She was sentenced to 15 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 10. Emily's parents felt little solace in the outcome. Their daughter was gone, and no sentence could change that. But for Nora Langley, the verdict brought a measure of closure. The truth had come to light, and justice, imperfect as it often was, had been served. The air outside the courthouse was thick with emotion. Reporters scrambled for interviews as Rachel Mercer was escorted out, her hands cuffed and her head bowed. The once proud mother and wife was now a convicted felon. For the residents of Cedar Ridge, the trial had become an obsession, a grim mirror reflecting the fragility of their seemingly idyllic community. Detective Nora Langley watched from a distance, the noise of the crowd fading into the background. Cases like this left scars, not just on the families involved but on everyone who had touched the truth, even briefly. For Nora, the hardest part was always the aftermath. She had uncovered the truth, but justice didn't heal wounds. It only laid the path for others to begin the process of healing. The Harper household was quiet in the weeks following the trial. Emily's room remained untouched, her bed still neatly made, her cheerleading trophies gathering dust on the shelf. Mrs. Harper would sit in the doorway some nights, staring into the room as though expecting Emily to walk back through the door. She deserved so much more, she whispered to her husband one evening. She was just a child. Mr. Harper wrapped his arms around her, his own tears silent but steady. "We have to find a way to honor her," he said. "She wouldn't want us to live like this, trapped in grief." The idea of a scholarship fund in Emily's name began to take shape. It would be awarded to young women pursuing higher education in fields like psychology or counseling, careers dedicated to helping others heal from the kinds of emotional wounds that had plagued Emily's short life. In prison, Rachel Mercer faced a reality she could never have imagined. The sterile walls and unrelenting schedule were nothing compared to the guilt that haunted her. She relived the night in the woods over and over, her mind replaying Emily's laughter, her taunts, and the moment she had crossed the line from anger to violence. Her cellmate, an older woman named Marjorie, offered a form of companionship that Rachel hadn't expected. "You can't change what happened," Marjorie said one night, her voice low. "But you can decide what kind of person you want to be now." Rachel didn't respond, but the words stayed with her. Slowly, she began to seek therapy offered within the prison, delving into the layers of her depression and the choices that had led her to that fateful night. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to feel the depths of her pain, and, perhaps, the beginnings of a sliver of hope. Daniel Mercer had moved out of Cedar Ridge, taking his children with him to live with his parents in a neighboring town. The whispers and judgment from the community had become unbearable. Everywhere he went, he felt the weight of his actions, the ripple effects of his selfishness. He poured himself into fatherhood, determined to give his children stability despite the chaos he had caused. But late at night, when the house was quiet, he couldn't escape his guilt. He had failed Emily. He had failed Rachel. And most of all, he had failed his children. One day, while unpacking boxes in his parents' basement, he stumbled across a photo album. It was from his baseball days, a life that now felt like a distant dream. Among the pictures was one of him and Rachel, smiling broadly on their wedding day. "I hope one day you can forgive me," he whispered, his voice cracking. Whether he was speaking to Rachel, Emily, or himself, he wasn't sure. For Nora, the case became a lesson in the complexities of human relationships. She had seen cases of jealousy and betrayal before, but this one stood out for its tangled web of emotions: love, fear, desperation, and anger. It wasn't just about a crime, it was about people pushed to their limits. One evening, she drove out to the wooded area where Emily's body had been found. The crime scene tape was long gone, but the place still carried an air of melancholy. She stood among the trees, the silence wrapping around her like a shroud. "I hope you found peace, Emily," she murmured, her breath visible in the cold air. The investigation had taken its toll on her too. She'd spent countless sleepless nights piecing together evidence, interviewing witnesses, and navigating the emotional landmines of the case. Now that it was over, she felt an odd emptiness. Closure was a myth, she realized. All anyone could do was move forward. Cedar Ridge, once a quiet town, had become a place marked by tragedy. The high school introduced new policies, including stricter background checks for staff and mandatory training on maintaining professional boundaries. Counselors were brought in to help students process the trauma of losing a classmate under such horrific circumstances. The cheerleading team retired Emily's uniform number, holding a small ceremony in her honor. Taylor Reed, still grappling with the loss of her best friend, gave a tearful speech. "Emily was more than a cheerleader," she said, her voice breaking. "She was my sister. And I'll spend the rest of my life trying to live in a way that would make her proud." Months turned into years, and while the pain never fully disappeared, life began to inch forward. The Emily Harper Memorial Scholarship became a beacon of hope, giving young women the chance to pursue their dreams in Emily's memory. Each recipient was reminded of the importance of kindness, resilience, and seeking help when needed. Rachel Mercer, now 5 years into her sentence, began leading support groups for other inmates struggling with mental health issues. She found solace in helping others, though the weight of her actions never left her. She wrote letters to Emily's parents, apologizing and explaining, though she never sent them. Some things, she felt, were better left unsaid. Detective Nora Langley continued her work, each case a reminder of the fragility of life. But she carried Emily's story with her, a quiet reminder of the importance of compassion and the complexities of justice. On what would have been Emily's 25th birthday, Cedar Ridge held a candlelight vigil in her honor. Dozens of people gathered, their faces illuminated by the flickering glow. Among them were Emily's parents, Taylor, and even Nora, standing silently in the back. As the crowd sang a soft, somber tune, a sense of unity washed over them. Emily's life, though tragically short, had touched so many. Her story had become a cautionary tale, a reminder of the consequences of secrets and the importance of empathy. As the candles burned down, the Harper family stood together, their grief still present but tempered by the knowledge that Emily's legacy lived on, in the scholarship fund, in the lives of its recipients, and in the hearts of those who remembered her.